буквально. Хорошо?
Хорошо, да, хорошо.
Ну, мало ли, там просто такое, что у них встреча ШЕРП, и вот мы сегодня с ним переписывались, он прислал презентацию. Андрей, у вас все есть, да, и презентация, и текст, и мы отправили это переводчикам.
Да.
Да.
Ну хорошо, тогда ждем минуту и можно начинать, я уже не буду вступать.
Hello, dear colleagues, dear friends. We start the third session of the conference on monetary policy, trade and investment for sustainable development, resetting needed. And I would like to start with pointing out that international trade and investment are the important tool to achieve agenda of sustainable development goals. And 17th goal, partnership, explicitly recognized trade as a means of implementation for SDG agenda, overall agenda. And having the idea of leaving no one behind across all goals. With respect to trade, Addis Ababa Action Agenda points specifically the need for accelerated development of trade and cooperation from developing countries, and in particular, least developed countries. And commitment to integration of sustainable development to trade policy at all levels by all countries. However, recent developments because of pandemic, it not only affected economic perspective of countries, but policies and trade policies as well. In 2020, we saw enormous increase in protectionist measures by all countries and G20 countries especially. On one hand, the development of COVID vaccine, highlighted the importance of cooperation as each vaccine has a number of components from different countries and different trade partners. And the emergence of these vaccines, the creation of these vaccines was possible because of this cooperation. But at the same time, we observe a number of cases when countries use subsidies and very distorted subsidies which affect trade and specifically trade by developing and least developed countries. So worldwide supply chains are very constricting, and some countries are promoting reshoring. So we observe a number of actions which actually work against achieving sustainable development goals. So this important development undermines the possibility of effective multilateralism, which should work for poorest and most vulnerable countries. And debt crisis for the developing world looks like a real possibility today. Supply shocks in developed countries brought the risks of inflations and potential increase in interest rates. So there are a number of developments actually provides and indicate a lot of risks to international trade and sustainable development being achievable. So today we will discuss these current risks and current trends in multilateralism and international trade with our very distinguished speakers. And I would like to ask everyone to speak within 7-minute framework in order for us to be able to have discussion afterwards. And I would like to give a floor first to our speaker, Dmitry Belichevsky, the director of the Department of Economic Cooperation, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, and we asked him to present Russian priorities in the context of the current trade in international trade and trade policy worldwide. Dmitry, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Thanks,
everybody. Thank you very much, Dr. Volchkova, for the introduction, and it is my honor and privilege to be invited to this very representative and very topical conference. I believe that our discussion yesterday and today is very much important due to the forthcoming events which will determine the future of our international community for the next few years. I mean, the forthcoming G20 summit in Rome, as well as the Glasgow Climate Conference and Ministerial Conference of WTO in Geneva in December. I would like to make a few observations from the point of view of the Foreign Ministry, who is has a role of a sort of coordinator of our foreign economic policy, as well as a mailbox for communication with different countries and organizations. So coming back to the topic of our discussion, I would like to start with a statement that despite significant measures of support taken by leading international and financial organizations like IMF, World Bank, EBRD, and others, as a reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, the current situation with assistance to the countries in need still is very much unclear and equivocal. We have a lot of problems, accumulated problems and deficiencies of the current model of the world financial architecture and the monetary and credit policy taken by Bretton Woods institutions. As an example, the IMF, which is aimed to quickly react to emerging problems of the member countries, for example, with the payment balance or liquidity, it has proven to be unable to meet the request for emergency financing of the most vulnerable countries. The current procedure of taking decision in the fund to provide with the loans still allows to the leading shareholders to block the provision of money, having in mind the political objections, political motivation. And it is in the circumstances of very hard humanitarian crisis in a number of countries. I mean, for example, Iran or Venezuela. This kind of situation emphasizes the importance of to activate, to redouble efforts to reform this international financial institution with the aim to secure more just and more independent from, I would say, personal views, the system of its governance. It is evident that the criteria and the procedures of the fund in considering the request from member countries to provide credit resources, they need to be reconsidered and adapted to modern realities. Also, the loan policies and approaches of the same way, they are pushed by the Western countries in the World Bank. In particular, despite the necessity of financial resources to combat COVID-19, the request by official Syrian government, by Damascus, to provide financial assistance is still without any reaction, any response from the part of the World Bank. But it is evident that Syria, which is in the process, in the state of armed conflict for recent few years, and there are a lot of humanitarian problems, very harsh humanitarian problems. And also, Syria also is suffering from the pandemic, and it has a lot of risks in this field. So this country has a legitimate right to get financial assistance from the international community. So such politicized approaches towards a number of states, and sometimes the policy to close the eyes when other countries request for financing but don't meet the necessary criteria of the IMF World Bank. This kind of policy makes us sure that there is a strong necessity for the reform of governance of the World Bank and correction of its credit and loan policy. The ultimate goal, in our view, is to elaborate a non-discriminatory principles and norms of providing financing. So we believe that it is necessary to rethink all this system of functioning and governing of these international institutions. Without this global rethinking, fundamental rethinking, the reform will be very much limited and will have little effect. Now, the next part of my statement will be dedicated to the trade issues. So, as you're very well aware, the concept of the foreign policy approved by the President of the Russian Federation and also the strategy of national security says that one of the key tasks for our diplomacy, including economic diplomacy, is to provide favorable external conditions to secure sustainable social-economic development of our country. To succeed in this field, we need an active and meeting current realities foreign economic policy, including the trade dimension. And you are pretty well aware that we have to work in very complicated circumstances. One of the factors which makes us difficult to promote our foreign trade goals, for example, to expand our exports of value-added products, to remove trade barriers, was one of the main barriers was the pandemic of coronavirus. But there are also other major problems. The world trade system is in the grip, or I would say in the pinch, of multilateral protectionist measures. We observe the geopolitical tensions and a lot of disparities in the economic spheres, including trade conflicts. There is also an epidemic, of course, in brackets, epidemic of one-sided sanctions or limitations, which are used as a matter of political pressure for those, I would say, unwanted countries. And also for protectionism of the economies of the West, mainly the United States and European Union. All such policies lead to fragmentation of world economy, disruption of the ties and production and logistic chains which were elaborated for decades. Overall, we look forward to recovery of normal activity of WTO, which we believe remains to be a central point in regulation of international trade. Since Russian accession to WTO in 2012, we are now efficiently have become a part of this WTO family. We raised our profile in trade negotiations, and now we are, together with other delegations, actively preparing, collectively preparing for the 12th Ministerial Conference in December. We are sure that only following to the principles of international law and the rules of WTO, and when we get rid from protectionist measures and take into account interests of each country, that will allow the international community to effectively fight the global threats. We again proceed.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time, so you have just half a minute, please.
Okay, I'm finishing. So one of our priorities is the integration on the post-Soviet space. We will promote our ties with our neighbors in Eurasian Economic Community and call upon all interested countries, including European Union and our Asian neighbors, to take part in the work to formulate a big Eurasian space from Vladivostok to Lisbon. And I think only under unpoliticized and pragmatic approaches we will be able to achieve good results in the economic sphere. And of course, I must mention the paramount importance of the G20 activities, including in the trade issues, climate change and green economy, health. So now our Sherpas are working hard for 3 days to try to draft the document for our leaders. And I think this declaration, which I hope will be adopted in Rome, a consensus document, will be a main direction for us. And OECD will have a paramount role in providing, expertise for the rules and norms and standards, which will be of great use for all of our countries. I think the next speaker, Nicolas Pinot from OECD, will follow the discussion in this. I thank you very much for giving me the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. Thank you for such a thorough overview of the Russian position with regard to these current trends and risks. And you pointed out that international organizations should reconsider its practices and algorithm create tools to assist the most vulnerable countries in times of global crises. And in that regard, we would like to invite to our discussion Nicholas Pinaud, who is OECD Sherpa to the G20 and G7. In one of the research of the international organization, Andrew Rose from Berkeley compared the effect of various international organizations on development of international trade. And to surprise of many economists, it was OECD that had the most tremendous effect on international trade development rather than WTO or World Bank or IMF. So OECD is an important instrument in developing trade and maybe in changing those trends that we're discussing now. Nicholas, we would like to hear your views on this current situation and OECD stance with regard to it.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a very important discussion, and thanks for the kind words for the OECD. I had a couple of slides. I'm not sure whether you put it up on the screen or I can do it otherwise. Okay. There you go. Yeah, so I would like to share some reflections about post-pandemic recovery efforts, trade, investment, and their alignment or lack of alignment with sustainable development goals. Let me start by recalling that obviously the COVID-19 pandemic had a very strong and adverse impact on the SDGs, and notably through the channels of trade and investment. Progress on the SDGs, it must be said, was already slow before the crisis, but has been further derailed by the crisis. And some progress is even reversing, with poverty rising for the first time in more than 20 years last year. Also, the financing for sustainable development was adversely impacted during the pandemic. Even before the COVID-19 crisis, financing for the SDGs was not enough. The OECD estimated that annually, and this is what is on the slide, that annually 2.5 trillion US dollar were missing to achieve the 2030 agenda on the SDGs. And of course, the crisis has only made things worse. We estimated, first we estimated 1 trillion additional financing need for COVID-19 emergency spending in developing countries. Secondly, developing countries were obviously beaten hard by the crisis, notably through trade and international investment channels. And therefore, we've seen a slump, a drop in external finance going to developing countries. For instance, developing countries experienced a drop of 42% in newly announced FDI-related greenfield projects. And overall, we estimate that external financing to developing countries dropped by an estimated 400 billion US dollar in 2020. So overall, if you pull all those trends together, the annual SDG financing gap in developing countries may actually have increased by around 1.7 trillion US dollar last year. So that's about plus 70%. Also, the crisis, and that's another channel, underlined the lack of diversification of developing economies and their over-reliance on raw commodity exports that obviously took a hit in the context of falling global demand in 2020. And those impacts highlighted a number of deep-rooted structural vulnerabilities in developing countries, the over-reliance on external financing, which I have just described, ODA, external private finance, remittances, but also the limited and narrow-based integration of those countries in global value chains and their low productivity as well. So that's the picture at the end of 2020. Fortunately, and certainly since then, there have been some good news. We are actually observing a stronger than anticipated rebound of the global economy. We published our economic outlook 1 month ago, and in this economic outlook, we project global growth to rise by around 6% this year and close to 4.5% next year. There is a rebound in trade, which is a strong engine behind the ongoing recovery. There is a rise in commodity prices, which is beneficial to certain developing countries, not all of them, but many of them. We also see a rebound in global FDI inflows, which in the first quarter of this year were 25% higher than in the first quarter of 2019. So some positive trends, but still there is no room for complacency. And what we can say is that this rebound is not necessarily conducive to more sustainable development going forward, let alone the achievement of the SDGs by 2030. And in fact, the progress on the latter really is lagging behind. First of all, I'm not so optimistic because when we look at this rebound, it is very uneven between advanced economies on the one hand and emerging economies and developing countries on the other hand. Developing countries are, generally speaking, left behind in this global recovery, with several factors driving their slow recovery. The slow vaccination deployment, further infection outbreaks, associated containment measures, limited policy support also, which is much less important than in advanced economies. And obviously, Chair, you mentioned the debt issue, debt overhang in many of them, which limit their access to capital markets. The second element, which is really a reason to be cautious about the positive impact of this rebound, is that when we look at the post-pandemic recovery efforts, they are not actually setting the global economy on a path toward the achievement of SDG 13, 14, and 15, and those which are related to biodiversity and climate change. In fact, the OECD has done some analysis on the content of recovery packages, recovery stimulus, and we have shown that spending on environmentally positive measures represents only 1/5, it's around 20%, of total COVID-19 recovery spending in OECD and G20 members. So only 1/5 of stimulus package will have a positive impact on the environment and on climate. So also from that perspective, post-pandemic recovery efforts are not necessarily leading to conducive to an acceleration of the achievement of the SDGs. The third element is that we remain to be seen whether trade and investment will be also conducive to sustainable development going forward. This is not guaranteed, but still, and there I would like to give a reason to be optimistic. On the bright side, we are indeed observing interesting developments in the G20, in APEC, or in WTO, for instance, on the discussion around trade, investment, and global public goods. And one important area is obviously in the context, in the current context, is trade, investment, and health, which is SDG 3. We see a number of initiatives that are being discussed, in particular in the context of MC12 preparation, and that were also discussed by G20 ministers this week in Sorrento. They include, for instance, the trade-related aspect of intellectual property rights with respect to vaccine. And you know that there is this initiative by South Africa and India in the context of WTO. And we will see how this initiative lands at MC12. Obviously, it is relatively controversial, but we can still make some progress on those issues of intellectual property rights during the MC12. There are also international efforts to expand production and delivery of vaccines, therapeutics, and essential medical goods, as well as diversifying manufacturing locations with the establishment of regional manufacturing hubs and fostering more generally the equitable distribution of vaccines. We have seen also some proposal, for instance, from the Ottawa Group for commitment to refrain from export restrictions, from imposing tariffs on essential medical goods during the health crisis, to encourage regulatory compatibility, ensuring transparency, and implementing trade facilitation measures for medical goods. And so all these are really initiatives which are going in the right direction. But for sure, generally speaking, we need to really pay more attention to the quality of trade, making trade work for all, upgrading developing countries' participation in global value chains, fostering their diversification, but also looking at the quality of investment, and in particular, its contribution to local development. And this is why the OECD has developed what we call Fdi Qualities Indicators and a related policy toolkit. The objective of this toolkit is really to measure the impact of FDI on sustainable development, particularly on productivity and innovation, job quality and skills, gender equality, but also, as I mentioned before, the low carbon transition. And we also put emphasis on FDI spillover impacts on domestic businesses, SMEs, through transmission channels such as value chain linkages, labor mobility, or other market interactions. And based on those indicators, we are offering sort of a guidance to policymakers to maximize the sustainable development impact of FDI. So to conclude, Chair, the nexus between trade and investment on the one hand and sustainable development on the other hand is very much an agenda in the making at the international level, probably for the medium to long term. But for sure, the pandemic has really provided a new impetus to this agenda, as we can see, and as I've shown in the area of health. There are also interesting developments in terms of trade and the environment. But really, in the short term, what is really most important is to ensure better alignment of our post-pandemic recovery efforts with some of the SDGs, in particular SDG 13, 14, and 15. So I leave it there, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicholas. So you confirmed the damage to safety net around the world in many respects, and poor and less developed countries being quite behind of all goals, and especially to some related to health and sustainability. So we would like to ask now Franco Bruni, Vice President and Co-Head of Italian Institute for International Political Studies, and more importantly, the lead co-chair of the Task Force on International Finance think tank G20 Italy, on what are the most important proposals by Think 20 with respect to issues we are discussing today to G20 summit. Franco, the floor is yours, and I would like to ask you to keep very strictly to 7 minutes.
Thank you for having me with you. And let me address the topic of global governance from the point of view of monetary policy. Let me do it by referring to the work of the Task Force on International Finance of the G20. Well, two issues that have inspired two of the 15 policy briefs that we have produced. Let me give you an idea of these two proposals. First, the issue of normalizing monetary policies that have been extremely expansionary during the last decade, and even more so during the pandemic. Sooner or later, normalization has to take place to avoid inflation, to moderate central bank encouragement to the excessive expansion of public debts, to remedy the serious distortion in the allocation of resources. There is a general agreement now that the normalization must be smooth and gradual, carefully announced to the markets. All this to prevent shocks to the markets with potential financial crises deriving from fast increase in the burden of the debts and abrupt increases of decreases of market prices of securities. The methods and the time profile of normalization are complex technical themes, and it seems better here to stress one specific aspect, which is the need to coordinate internationally the strategies of the various countries to normalize their monetary policies. And uncoordinated normalization can be very damaging for the world economy, creating awkward asymmetries in the profile of financial conditions between the major economies, between them and emerging economies, between the better developed and the poorest countries. Coordinated normalization doesn't mean identical normalization moves everywhere. Paths can be different, respectful of the different conditions of different countries, but have to be compatible and decided together. It is crucial to stress now that what is required is not the secret, informal coordination, which is already taking place among central bankers. What we need is an official, transparent, joint announcements of monetary strategies that can also serve as a commitment to reinforce the credibility of monetary authorities, providing a benchmark to judge the coherence and the time consistency of their future decisions And we call on the IMF to act as a director of this transparent and official coordination. The second point I would like to make is the fact that the 5-6 major central banks of the world have an enormous influence, not only on global monetary conditions, but also on financial regulations and global financial policies in general. In spite of this, central banks are legally required to use their resources to fulfill their domestic mandates. Therefore, they are motivated to focus primarily on domestic rather than global concerns. And they favor the allocation of their resources to countries and entities that are viewed as having a significant impact on their domestic monetary and financial situation, rather than to those most in need in the globe. This situation creates a strong bias in the governance of the international monetary and financial system towards the home states of the key central banks and those states of most interest to them. This bias increases the risk that global financial governance will work to the detriment of poorer and less influential states and will strengthen the existing maldistribution of power and wealth in the world, and it may also adversely affect the sustainability of the global economy in the planet. As a remedy, the authors of one of our policy briefs formulate international standards to guide central banks to incorporate in their mandates specific responsibilities towards the rest of the world. The standards could be classified in 3 categories. First, responsibility to understand. Central banks should undertake ex-ante assessments of the cross-border impacts of all proposed bank decisions, central bank decisions, both regulatory and financial stability actions. Second, responsibility to disclose. Central banks should prepare regular reports available to the world community describing the impacts of all decisions that have an extraterritorial impact, in fact. 3, responsibility to monitor and learn. And this means that the G20 should request an international body such as the Bank of International Settlements or the Financial Stability Board to establish an independent office to review the global financial governance activities of central banks. In other words, what we advocate is that there is a sort of a coordination at the center and a special committee devoted to show that the major central banks of the world have been taking care also of the impact of their actions on the rest of the world, with particular care to the countries that are most in need of international care. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Franco, for very interesting proposals and very novel one. I think it looks like instead of, while being independent within boundaries of countries, the proposal is to set up some international cross-border, not regulation, but these guidelines for central banks. Very interesting, and we'll see how the reaction of G20 central bankers will be with regard to this. But I believe this is very important because the trade policy provided a lot of chaos today in the world, and the developing and least developed countries are really discuss how their reaction of their countries to change in interest rates by developed country will look like. And now it's a very important issue that I discussed because a lot of unpredictability it will bring to countries and to sustainable development, most of all. Thank you, Franco. And now I give the floor to our next speaker, Zhejin Zhu, professor of the School of International Relations and Public Affairs of Fudan University. And Dr. Zhu, we would like to hear the Chinese priorities in the international multilateral trade system and the prospects of Chinese trade and economic recovery in next years. It looks like we lost Zhu.
He was here.
It was, but not anymore. Something probably with connection.
Well, he's. I can see that he's still here.
He's connecting right now.
Okay.
He's connecting. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Regine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I will share my PPT. So can you see the PPT?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I want to talk about the trade from the China with the WTO perspective. This year is a 20-year anniversary for China to join the WTO. The China joined the WTO in 2001. First, I want to talk about the two key issues in the relationship between China and the WTO, and also very controversial two topic. One is the market economy status. The second is the developing country status. So I want to go back to the history very briefly. How in the history has solved these two issues? Is China a market economy status, or is China a developing country? Second is currently now China played some partial leadership in the WTO, also related to these two issues. First, the market economy status and the developing country status. So these are very two headaches, I think, for the Chinese diplomats in the Geneva. Is China market economy, or is China still a developing country? So American view will be very absolutely no, absolutely not. China is not a market economy. China is still, is not a developing country anymore. But the Chinese view will be yes. So why? Why the two views are so different? Generally, I go back to the history and try to read the negotiation. Then I think the American view is more static, while the Chinese view is more dynamic. American is using the several static standards to assess whether China is being a market economy or is China being a developing country. While the Chinese negotiators is not looking at it from the being perspective, it's more like from the becoming. It's a process. So in the negotiation, the Chinese diplomats will use evidence to prove that China is transforming to the market economy, and China now is still a developing country. So look at the negotiation. In the 1980s, when the Chinese diplomats in Geneva first time applied for the membership of the GATT, at that time, the Americans asked 5 questions for the Chinese trade policy. The first is the implementation of the Chinese trade policy. Second, transparency. Third, non-tariff measures. Fourth is a market-oriented price reform. The fifth is a selective safeguard clause. So how the Chinese response to the Americans? So the five concerns, the Chinese at that time is the number one is yes, the Chinese will reform. The second, yes. 3, yes. 4, yes. Also, to some extent, yes. But 5, well, no. Why? Because it is related to the market economy status. So, after the Uruguay round, 1994, the WTO, welcome. So at that time, the not only the market economy issue, but also the developing country issue. So the negotiation deadlocked for a long time. And then finally, how the US and China solved the issue. At that time, the US Bill Clinton administration and the Chinese Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji at that time. The November 15, the 1999, the US-China finally, after almost a decade, reached the agreement. On the market economy, I looked at the negotiation. I think, it has not solved the issue, but in the final agreement, then both sides agreed case by case. It means that from the political perspective, we cannot solve the issue. Is China a developing country or is China a market economy country? So they choose to cooperate, then transforming the issue from the political issue to the legal issue. It means the case by case. The second, the developing country issue. The US recognized China as a developing country, but the Chinese has to make more commitments than the developing countries. So currently, that's the history of the China's accession to the WTO. Now, currently, almost after 20 years, what's the role in China in the WTO? Also, I think the two issues are the headaches for the diplomats. So look at the new case. Just in recent years, 2 or 3 years, the investment facilitation
We don't hear you, Eugene.
Sorry, we have connection failure. We cannot hear you. We have connection failure immediately after switching to this slide. Excuse me, connection failure.
So, Eugene, do you hear us?
Can you hear us, sir?
Yes.
We don't hear you.
There's poor connection. So I believe we then need to switch to another speaker, and maybe Eugene will recover connection and join us, finish his talk later. Agree? Okay. And I think that we now have our last speaker, and the issue of importance of global trade is recognized by everyone, but given the important drawbacks in the development of multilateral trade system, which was highlighted by most of speakers before and by Zhejiang as well. And Dmitry, in the beginning, emphasized the role of regional integration that Russia considers to be a very important development in its international trade recently. So, Yaroslav, my question to you is about the role, whether regionalization can solve the issues that we are discussing today and bring the world back to sustainable development goals and achieving trade facilitation and provide trade facilitation for developing and least developed countries.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and thank you very much to the organizers of the conference. It's a tremendous honor and pleasure to be part of this discussion. Yes, I think regionalization actually, in my view, is at the very heart of the potential solutions to the challenges that the global economy is facing today. In fact, if you look at the list of key challenges, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's green development and ecological challenges, whether it's the energy crisis, clearly regionalism, regional issues have a role to play here because you cannot solve these issues purely, solely at the national level. You need regional cooperation to solve these issues where these spillover effects across economies are so strong and significant. If we're talking about themes such as ecology, for example. So I think within the global governance construct, one of the key gaps is the lack of a governance layer that brings together regional organizations, regional trading arrangements. And in this respect, we can think of a potential coordination mechanism or coordination platform that brings together regional trading arrangements and has more of a coordination amongst them, with the WTO, the World Trade Organization, playing a role of a facilitator of this coordination. And of course, to some degree, some of these mechanisms are already in place, and there is some coordination on the part of the WTO with regard to these issues, but I think it should be more integrated into the regular agenda of the World Trade Organization, and there should be more coordination horizontally across regional integration arrangements. The same thing we can say with regard to monetary policy. There could be more of a horizontal coordination across the so-called regional financing arrangements. And the IMF has already undertaken these exercises, and actually twice per year there are discussions organized by the G20 and the IMF of coordination across regional financing arrangements. So something along these lines to be a more formal mechanism, a more reinforced coordination horizontally across these regional arrangements, I think, would be called for. And then, of course, also the third dimension of what we have in the discussion today, investment. The World Bank could be a platform for more of a coordination across regional development banks. And again, I can say that there's already a platform to coordinate migration policies across regional development banks that has been created by the World Bank. You can do something along these lines with regard to green development and the green agenda and other key topics, green financing, that are at the focal point of attention for the global economy today. Overall, if you look at the resources of regional development banks, their sum is greater than the resources of the World Bank. The same thing with regard to regional financing arrangements versus the IMF. And of course, if you sum up the power and the might of regional trading arrangements, it far exceeds that of the WTO. I think another dimension that we can think of is the so-called R20 the regional 20 that could bring together the regional integration arrangements where G20 countries are members. This is one of the initiatives that was launched by the Fdi Club several years ago. So I think there's a lot to think about in terms of how we can bring on board regional arrangements, and thinking about the stimulus, anti-crisis stimulus. Clearly, regional arrangements have a role to play here. I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yaroslav. It's also very interesting proposition about coordination of regional institutions, both trade and investment institutions, and it's might be a tool to overcome the problems of multilateral system. Gigin, you can have 1 minute to finish your talk. Sorry for such.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. I will finish in 1 minute. So I think that in the new investment facilitation agenda, China, to some extent, is redefining the agenda and redefining the developing country, the identity. So my conclusion is that now for the WTO and for the global trade governance, now is China paradox. China both a developing country and economic powerhouse, and also both a market economy and the developmental state. So now is power shifting. We need to renegotiate the WTO rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Gigin. Yeah, so it's definitely a problem of multilateral system that China points out is not unique to China. So Russia is also facing the problem of market status in WTO, or at least not by United States rules and European Union. So it's we understand the concerns and issues, and this is also it does not help developing multilateralism. It's vice versa, put more pressure on it. So I would like to sum up the session, and I think the important issue that everyone agreed that multilateral system was even more damaged by coronavirus crisis, and recovery, economic recovery that world observed this year is not homogeneous across countries, and the poorest countries, they are leaving behind of this recovery. And the new developments that the world goes through, such as financial and monetary policy change expected in developed countries, might put even more pressure on these developed countries. For this, the coordination of central banks that will go through important change in monetary policy is needed. The proposal is also to use the successful regionalization by many institutions as a potential tool to overcome the multilateral problems. So we did not have time, and because of other issues are so important, we didn't discuss a lot today green agenda, because it's also expects to be quite expensive for developing and poor countries, and it need to be reconsidered. It need to be considered, taking into account by developed country while going further into this endeavor. So overall, we conclude with emphasizing that more emphasis by international organization and G20 should be on keeping poor and developing countries on board in economic recovery and in the next years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you. And thanks to all the speakers.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Do we have a break, or shall we pass on immediately to the next session? Marina and everybody, good afternoon.
I think we have got all the speakers here, so we can, and it is 2 o'clock, so we can begin. The floor is yours.
Yeah, excellent. Nice to meet you again. Nice to
Nice to
meet
see you.
everybody again. Yeah, I saw Professor Sanchul Park's greeting. Good friend of mine, good friends gathered together. Unfortunately, not offline. Well, coronavirus is still ruling the world, but we hope that anytime soon we will conquer that virus. So today we are coming to the next session, session 4. That's about digital transformation. And we will talk about data, digital technologies, and definitely that's an interesting point, how those digital technologies could make an impact for inclusive and sustainable growth. So that is the ambition, to learn more about this. We have 5 speakers, 5 distinguished speakers within this session. The timing will be rather strict. I suggest not more than 10 minutes for each of the speakers. The first one on my list is, yes, Marina, you wanted to comment something?
Yes, actually, I asked each speaker to focus and make it 7 minutes so that we have some time for discussion.
No, that's even more strict a timetable. Well, okay, I'm always more liberal in my ideas. Sorry for that. Well, sometimes liberalism is in defense. So the first speaker on my list is Rohington Medora. He is a president of the Center for International Governance and Innovation and a member of the Commission on Global Economic Transformation. So the floor is yours. You can start.
Well, thank you, Vladimir, and it's good to see all of you again. Thank you, Marina and colleagues, for having me back to your very interesting event. I'm all for shorter speaking times. If it gives us more time to interact at the end, Marina, you can make 7, 5, and I'm okay with it. What I thought I'd do in the few minutes, and since I am the lead-off speaker, is to not speak so much about how digital technologies can make a difference. I think I'm making the assumption that you take any facet of development, be it health, education, climate, it can make a difference. But ask ourselves, what are the sort of 2 or 3 key fundamental points that we should be thinking about for that connection between digital technologies and new technologies more broadly, and sustainable and equitable development to happen. And so my first point would be to understand that absolutely every change in technology these days is a public-private partnership. There are spillover effects from the application of technology. Many technologies are merit goods, but by the same token, many technologies are dual use. And so all technologies have a good side to them and a bad side to them. Therefore, there are 2 obvious reasons why governments and citizens should be interested in the regulation of technologies. And the regulation of technologies is not an optimistic phrase. It is not something that should not be seen. It should be seen as a natural thing. In the presence of merit goods and public goods and bads, I think there's a ready case for some kind of intervention. And that's clear when you think about some of the sort of club effects of the ICT revolution, for example. And also when you think, and I'll come back to this in a minute as well, in the development of most new technologies, but most recently the vaccines, certainly in the West, they have been the result of years and years and tens of billions of dollars of investment by public authorities through taxpayers' funds in platform technologies, in advanced market commitments, in shortcuts during the trial period. And so you add all of that up, and I think the case for why we should be thinking of technologies as being part and parcel of public policy and not something that is exogenous to the growth equation, to me, is obvious. There's 2 facets to this. I would say data, which increasingly drives everything we do. and the intellectual property regime. And both of those, as we've heard already in some of the sessions, could use some revisiting. In the case of data, I'm especially concerned, and I'd raised this last year as well, because in an era in which we still, although we're skeptical about globalization, we still broadly understand why international cooperation is a good thing, we find that the world is balkanizing into data zones, and you have a sort of state-centric China zone. You have its mirror image in the US, where, again, citizens are not empowered, but it is firms that control and manage data. And then in between, you have the European Union, where ostensibly citizens are empowered through the Gdpr. And then fourth, you might have hybrid regimes in India, Russia, all the countries that are sort of looking into this tripartite governance system. And I think the big challenge for global diplomacy in our generation, among many, but is going to be to make these three data zones talk to each other and to create norms and processes so that data is more or less treated similarly multilaterally and does not become something that is seen as a regional purview, because data isn't and shouldn't be. The second aspect of the link between technologies and development would be IP. And on this, I will simply say the vaccine rollout for COVID has been a fiasco. It shows how unequal the measures are. About 3 weeks ago, the world delivered its 5 billionth, dose of the vaccine. And yet many countries in the world have yet to achieve 2% vaccination rates. There's lots and lots of evidence of how the vaccine rollout is not only unequal, and that's not just a humanitarian thing, but that inequality actually leads to variants and prolongs the pandemic throughout the world. And so again, if we see central technologies like vaccines as being global public goods, then we have to treat them that way and not as private goods. And if there is time for discussion, there's a range of things I can think of on the IP front that we should be doing. And so that brings me to my final point, which is, what does all of this have to do with development? And if you think of sort of the things we learned and we teach in development over the years, basic needs, change in income, capabilities, I subscribe to that sort of capabilities approach, in which you see development in its fullest sense as being about people being able to achieve their full potential, including sort of intellectual and human freedoms. If you look at it that way, then you can see how data and IP and how we manage data and IP become central to development. Because how data is used, how it's shared, how it's stored, to what purposes it is used, how innovation happens, how IP is created and protected, is all part and parcel of that development process. And some of us would argue is absolutely central to it. So I think if we want to understand where the world is headed, a very good place would be to examine how we treat data and IP. So I'll stop there for now and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much for your input into this topic. I suggest that we will have questions and organize a discussion at the end of the session, and then everybody could ask a question to anyone, if you don't mind. So, but to economize time, we will not organize each time a discussion. So the second speaker on my list, that's Jose Ciaba Serante, and I have a special pleasure to present him, because he not only because he is a member of the Argentine Council of Foreign Relations of the Argentine Academy of Capital Markets, and he is a lecturer and he has a lot of activities, but for us it is also very important to know that he is a co-chair of the Task Force on International Finance of the Think 20. Within the Italian presidency, within the G20. So we are looking forward to have more news about digital transformation from you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. I would stress that my work is related with financial issues, and my interest on digitalization comes from that side. And I agree to what Rohinton has said. And from the financial side, digitalization is a kind of revolution that is shaking the basis or the very basics of I would say, of the activity. In some places where you thought things were designed in a way that would not change in the future. For example, in the world of money and payments, there's a technological revolution. It's not only technology, but social transformation that are affecting, disrupting the status quo. Central banks all of a sudden have to ensure their money remains relevant. It is fit for the future due to these changes. This is true not only for money, but I would say for the rest of the financial system, legacy banks, infrastructure, regulation, fiscal and monetary policies, effectiveness. And you know that things are changing now, but if you look to the future, you clearly understand that this is just the beginning of a very important process. There's something so basic as the two-tier monetary system, which has endured for centuries, where you have a central bank at the center and private commercial banks and other related intermediaries as satellites that are connected. And this is the way the society nowadays produces money and credit. And this was very well established. And now, it has a very clear division of labor. It's a public-private sector task, with the central banks having the monopoly of issuance of base money, and private banks are in charge of creating broad money and credit creation, which in an advanced economy is a huge part of this business. But that we thought was something kind of a structure that would never change. Now it's facing threats, and there are other architectures that are feasible now, if not desirable. And you might think of decentralized peer-to-peer networks or centralized digital platforms that can provide the same services in a rather unreliable way nowadays, but that can change. And there is competition to this system, and central banks have been surprised by this. They dismissed the cryptocurrencies when they started, and rightly so. But the second generation of crypto assets, stable coins, was a different animal. You can't say those are not currencies, or they lack the potential to work as currencies. And now you have decentralized finance, so you can build upon those stable coins a whole financial system without the current financial intermediaries, and provide the same services in a rather unreliable way. But now you can demonstrate that you have the capacity to build a parallel financial system without or far from the control of the central bank. And if now it's not reliable, it can become so, and it can even surpass the services provided by the conventional system. So in an area that in many times was a leader of the changes, now something comes from outside, digitalization with a lot of strength. And central banks now are evaluating that they might adjust the monies and be ready to provide digital currencies in order just to stay afloat. And even though you can control this challenge by regulating it, and you can stop progress in a way, really your obligation is to provide the best monetary services, payment services to society, and that can become according to their preferences, and society is changing in a way that puts a lot of stress on central banks. And so reluctantly so, central banks are considering modifying the system. And this is a very important thing. You were used to control this area and to be the arbiter of this area. And now digitalization changes everything and shows you that if you do not move in advance, you might suffer in the future. Digitalization comes with a lot of benefits. So I think it's the right time for financial regulators and central banks to take care of this process in a way that I, with Claude Lopez and I from Milken Institute, and I from CARI have presented to the G20 Italy presidency a proposal that urges G20 leaders to develop a vision on the future of money and payments and to monitor it, to integrate that vision into their agenda in order to guide a financial system, a resilient financial system in a transition towards a digital age. We know that this will require the broadest international cooperation, and we know that the world needs a global digital governance compact for a responsible, inclusive digital economy. And within this compact, authorities have to develop a financial digital chapter, but it is within a more global governance framework that you will need, because many of the challenges you face come from, for example, big platforms that operate in different domains. And if you want to get the best from the digitalization process, you better have this aspect with a set of norms and codes and a lot of things that are not essentially financial, but are broader in scope that actually have no governance, no control, and that gives big platforms a huge edge. Because after Facebook presented their Libra project in June 2019, it became very clear that global digital platforms might develop their own currencies if they want, and built-in payment systems, and that would come as a natural extension of their businesses. And those platforms are biggest, hold more accounts, grow quicker than our biggest financial institutions. Data has become the most valuable assets. If you take the 8 companies in the world with the highest capitalization, 7 of them are related with digital. JP Morgan, which is the biggest bank, counts 13. You have had a problem with banks too big to fail. And now if banks can be surpassed by platforms, you might have even bigger companies and a biggest problem. And if you tackle these problem at the right time, you might be able to overcome the problem that in present the economy has, that if you have a huge blow in your financial system, you have to save the banks because you have the payment system allocated within the banks. So if the banks don't work, the economy ends without a payment system. And now you can have multiple payment systems, courtesy of digitalization. So there's a lot of challenge. There are a lot of opportunities, courtesy of digitalization, but you need governance first, I would say, to exploit fully the advantages presented by digitalization. So I'm not in the field properly of digitalization, but as someone that is seeing in his field a lot of challenge, I would say what we need is governance at the highest level, because we will also need very specialized governance rules for financial in order to let digitalization play its role, keep for the society the whole benefits of them, and keep under control the lot of risks and perils, which are very important and should have a clear knowledge of vision of them in order to get the most of these circumstances. So those are my points initially.
Thank you very much, Jose. You raised a lot of interesting topics, a lot of challenges. I'm particularly interested in some of the points you raised. We will definitely have time to discuss them later on. You talked about digital platforms introducing their own digital currencies or wishing to merge with banks, which could also raise their stakes. You raised a lot of other challenges of parallel financial system. Maybe the problem is that the leading financial institutions are lagging behind in advancing their own digital agenda to the world. And that's the way that we should think over and over again, whether European Union should advance a digital currency of the European Union, whether IMF should think about digital SDR or whatever. That's not happening so far. And
I also have an Napster allegory.
Yeah.
I think could be very interesting.
Yeah,
how should you react when you have a threat?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic for sure. Digital transformation and financial sector. We will come back to that topic. Thanks for raising these challenges. So now I have a special pleasure to introduce my old friend Sanchul Park, professor from Korea Polytechnic University. He's a frequent participant to our conferences here. And I'm looking forward and he has a clear-cut vision of the topic. So I'm looking forward to your ideas on the topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Yeah. So as requested, I prepared my presentation file in order to economize the time. So the two previous presenters talked about the macro level, how digital economy should be or working now and in the near future. And now I'm presenting about the emerging industrial sector in the digital economy, which is the smart cities. So smart cities is regarded as the highest level of fourth industrial revolution, starting with smartphones as the first level. All of you are using smartphones. And secondly, smart homes, some of you are using already, and the smart factories and smart cities. So smart cities are strengthening social and economic development and generating sustainable economic urban development. And why should we focus on smart cities? Is because of the new global urban agenda announced by the United Nations. If we look at the entire total number of population in the world, the urban population is increasing rapidly from 750 million in 1950 to 4.2 billion in 2018, which was 55% of the total population and is expected to increase continuously up to 70% by 2050. However, there is no single definition for smart cities, but regarding the OECD, the smart cities can provide intelligent and innovative solutions for urban ecosystems as a central theme. So smart city initiatives has become a major issue, particularly after the global financial crisis that creates a sustainable model for significant industrial sector in a digital economy. So we think the smart city as an industrial sector can generate $1.2 trillion this year and continuously grow up to the $2.5 trillion in 2025. So the goals of my studies are, number one, explaining roles of smart cities and exploring smart cities capability, and finally, analyzing socioeconomic feasibility of smart cities. So simply, I'd like to explain very clearly the trajectory of a fourth industrial revolution, and three industrial revolution we have already experienced, all of you know. Now we are heading for, or we already started officially last year, and pandemic pushed the or escalating the fourth industrial revolution process pretty strongly. So based on AI, big data, and Internet of Things, and robotics, and so on. The clear difference of fourth industrial revolution compared to the previous industrial revolutions is to create cyber and physical systems, so-called CPS. So what is a CPS is the communication systems between machines as well as between human and machines. In the third industrial revolution, using only computer and internet, we did not have the full capacity to communicate between machines. But now it's fully possible, as like this diagram shows, the industry 4.0, now the fourth industrial revolution. Machine learning or deep learning means the machines can learn by themselves and they can communicate by themselves and develop themselves simply. So the clear characteristics of industry 4.0 means horizontal integration through network is fully possible, as well as vertical integration subsystems is also functioning. So engineering integration across the whole value chain for customization of products is now in a reality. So what are benefits of the fourth industrial revolution, particularly in the manufacturing sector? Number one is a production process based on fully demand-oriented. The customized products is fully possible as daily goods, and zero waste of resources. So all industrial sectors do not generate any waste of resources anymore. And it provides the services in real time, not the long lead time. Therefore, the smart factory at the third level can be allocated and located near to the cities because it does not generate any hazardous materials and products. So production and consumption are combined in one location. So it's a pretty different concept compared to the conventional industrial sectors. So that increased around 20% of productivity in average. In the case of Germany, so 1% of GDP can grow by using this kind of mechanism, so-called CPS, and as well as new employment by 6%. So traditional manufacturing will face the severe challenges due to the CPS. So it is inevitable to shift to smart manufacturing based on automation and hyper connectivity toward smart cities. So let me introduce you more clearly. What are smart cities in the fourth industrial revolutions? As previous presenters already pointed out, the smart cities is generating huge data instead of certainly capital as well, but the core, the products is data. So now, if you look at the data capacity, from 1.2 million petabytes in 2010 to 33 zettabytes, different levels in 2018, and expected even 175 zettabytes in 4 years. And the 1.9 billion devices were connected in 2013, but increased up to 9 billion devices have been connected already in year 2018. So we expect year 2025, over 1 trillion devices could be connected. It means all the machines could be connected in reality. So high growth in data and connectivity, enabling to analyze and use real-time information and influencing public policy as well as new environment. So it is, in fact, a new paradigm shift in the global economy and particularly in the digital economy. So cities are regarded as a microcosm of social integration. So all smart cities approaching to serve their own problems. So there is no one-size-fits model because all cities as individuals are facing different problems and different conditions and so on. So for instance, major global cities are following digital twin strategy, meaning that real public problems can be solved in the virtual city by using simulating systems. They are using now, in fact. So the smart city policies in major countries are citizens' well-being and human-centric approaches are core points. So main issues for smart cities are improving quality of life and delivering solutions. And this is, in fact, the integrated holistic approach. So in Asia, Europe, North America, all major countries are focusing on building smart cities, as like this table shows. And the presenter talked about how different countries in the world approaches the digitalization. Even smart cities is more or less the same. Major Asian countries such as China, Korea, Japan, India, Singapore, they are trying mainly government-led the smart city building, while USA, they are mainly private sector-led smart cities, while the EU is trying to in between public and private cooperation-centered smart cities building. So why they are building the smart city? Because smart cities are a global new market, generating huge market in the near future, up to 2.5 trillion US dollars, as I said. So one thing is very clear, except the financial resources of creating economic values, smart cities are created by digital economy, paid for users. Users can access openly, free, so-called, while industry generating revenues by advertising, data, and additional services. So this is a totally new concept compared to the conventional industrial sectors. So smart cities providing data and services as a rising industry in digital economy, up to $2.5 trillion. And since the year 2010, as this graphic shows, annually, average 20% growth since year 2017, and expect up to the 2025. So major reasons for increasing global demand for smart cities are, first, increasing urbanization worldwide, so-called rapidly, as I explained in the introduction part, and various governments initiating funding and R&D, and rapidly increasing technological development. Therefore, we expect average 20% annual growth up to 2025. So all major economic regions are more or less the same direction. And then under the pandemic, what we can find is impacts of the pandemic on smart cities. So many governments deploying smart cities technologies, tracking spread of a virus and implementing medical strategies. And they also use smart platforms such as heat maps, GPS, etc. So they could find out the infections, disease, as well as infected people efficiently. So at the same time, smart cities are facing huge challenges such as a high cost and lack of expertise of proficiency of users, unfortunately. So in my analysis, whether or not smart city is functioning properly or generate real profit or not, my answer is yes. Based on the various analyses in the industrial sector to the academia, I found that the average 10 to 30% of increase in improving quality of life and in healthcare, etc., is like this diagram shows. And even in China, Alibaba's cloud assessments indicate that reducing average commuting time in Hangzhou with over 15%. And even academia's assessment by West is more or less same, 15%. So smart cities are being expected to become self-organizing cities with optimal production and consumptions, although we expect various challenges such as imminent disruption of the labor market, attracting talented workforce, social cohesion, inclusiveness and solidarity, cybercrime, security and privacy, etc. So my conclusions are, number one, being in the initial period of fourth industrial revolution era by 2020, last year, with the pandemic. So pandemic accelerated the fourth industrial revolution pretty strongly, and it is an ongoing process even now. So fourth industrial revolution based on own trajectory, starting smartphone to completing smart city. So building smart city is the highest level to complete the fourth industrial revolution. Thirdly, smart city as an emerging major global industrial sector in the digital economy with 15% of global GDP in year 2025. Number four is solving urban problems in 8 domains, as I showed you in the diagram, and improving average 10 to 30%. And finally, existing various challenges and finding solution measures is our future task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. That was excellent as usual. You raised a lot of interesting topics. Definitely smart cities and smart houses concepts do make an input into the inclusive and sustainable growth development, that's for sure. That's an interesting note that today you made a focus on digital aspects of smart cities. But you may have probably heard about the Moscow Energy Week, which is being held right now. And during these days, there was a special session within this Energy Week dedicated to smart cities. but they treated the topic of smart cities from the energy perspective. Smart homes and smart cities making the efficient use of energy and becoming more sustainable in terms of energy usage. So that's an interesting combination of two approaches. While you put a stress on the digital aspects of smart cities development, within the Moscow Energy Week, they put another focus on another aspect of this development. So probably these two basic concepts should be merged together, and then we will arrive to a still new thinking on that important development. And the final thing which I noticed, you talked about smart houses and smart cities, but nobody seems to talk yet about smart regions or something like that. But if we look into the development within some regions, if we look into the developments within the European Union, for instance, there are specific programs like LIFE program, and a special part of the LIFE program is dedicated to the development of smart homes and smart cities, and you can get the finance to remake your house in a smart way. And this makes it as a priority for the development. Smart cities and smart houses concept is becoming as a priority of the development of the whole region within the European Union. Maybe one day, anytime soon, we will talk about smart regions concepts as well. So, but these are, well, immense topics that we can further discuss. Yeah, you want to immediate comment? Let's make it short. Okay, go ahead.
You are fully right. As I showed you in the diagram, there is energy saving the index as well. Regarding the smart cities, the evaluation, energy sectors can be saved between 15 to 20% in average.
Absolutely.
And regarding the smart regions, it is the next level after building or completing smart cities. After building smart cities can be included in the smart region. So without building a smart cities fully, it's not possible to build the smart regions, in my mind.
Thank you for this comment. Thank you for this comment, valuable comment. We are looking forward to further developments in this area. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Marek Revizorski, a professor from the Institute of Political Science from the University of Gdańsk. Sorry for mispronunciation. We are talking about different kind of revolutions, like digital revolution in finance. In Poland, we have still another revolution. That's a political revolution within the European Union after the decision of the Constitutional Court of Poland. So, Marek, do you have more news, revolutionary news from Poland in terms of digital technologies? We are looking forward to your intervention. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Vlad. It's a great honor to be here again. I'm very happy to be in this conference. Thank you, Marina and colleagues, for the invitation. And well, yes, this is a big topic, and we have a small panel and a very few minutes to present. I was hoping to have a bit more time, but I will try to stress within the time I was given. Yeah, Poland and Hungary and France and Germany, we have all a big debates about digitalization, because it's becoming a very important part of well, a digital economy. Digitalization is very quickly coming into our life. And my presentation is, I think, is continuing this topic, and I will try to refer to my predecessors, I mean, to excellent presentation in this panel, and to carry on this topic on fragmentation of multilateralism, on challenges for global digital governance as well. And maybe it will be a bit more theoretical, less empirical, because I'm sorry, I'm coming from not economics perspective, but from perspective of political science. So maybe because of that. And my two conceptual bases for this for my presentation are first base of concept of multilateralism, which has been developed by John Ruggie, who understood multilateralism as institutional arrangements in the absence of international organizations, which can help to define or stabilize property rights, manage coordination, resolve collaboration problems. And the second base is the concept of conflictive fragmentations. It's not the new one because it was developed by Frank Meerman more than 10 years ago, but it's very helpful to see the fragmentation patterns in internet governance, in digital trade, in digital economy. And my goal in this presentation is to contribute to better understanding fundamental disagreement. It's coming everywhere, basically, between sovereign states and transnational corporations as to the very nature of sovereignty in cyberspace, so-called digital sovereignty. But I'm not recursing to define digital sovereignty is just beyond the reach of this presentation. And as I remember, the European Commission is trying to do it since 2012, and nothing really happens. There is no definitive definition of digital sovereignty. Anyway, just jumping quickly to this framework, conflictive fragmentation means a given regime, for example, internet regime, is characterized by three criteria. First is poor support for institutional integration, which is manifesting in the existence of different, largely unrelated institutions with poor level of integration and support of the regime. Second feature is conflictive and questioned by stakeholders, principles, norms, rules and decision-making procedures in the regime. So I'm referring to Stephen Krasner's understanding of international regime here, written in 1983, I think. Third feature is there are differences between major actors that support not coherent institutional designs. And speaking of challenge of fragmentation, we have basically three challenges in internet governance and digital economy. And my colleagues partly spoke of that before. I mean, conflictive fragmentation, discriminatory treatment, and protectionism that are discernible with regard to technology trends reshaping trade. This is important because digitalization is particularly interesting. Digital commerce already accounts for about 20% of global trade and is projected by some experts to increase even to 5% up to 2025. So despite its potential, virtual economic space is drastically underregulated. It's divided into several regional regimes, which are constantly competing, undermining each other. We might say, I do agree completely that digital trade is balkanized. We've heard this concept before. And there is conflict between public and private stakeholders of balkanized internet governance, which stems from lack of internet regime with core overseer organization and fundamental clash between different visions of digital sovereignty. At present, model of internet governance is based on multi-stakeholder model, is involving states, companies, civil society, and organization dominated mostly by the US, by some perceived as guardian of the centralized internet. And here I'm referring to such organizations like ICANN or Internet Engineering Task Force, which is responsible for network protocols. But this system is contested by some G20 emerging powers like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and they're proclaiming very interesting doctrine of internet sovereignty, as a sovereign right regulates national segment of the internet. And well, this conflictive fragmentation of internet governance is paired with fundamental disagreement between sovereign states and transnational corporations as to the very nature of sovereignty in cyberspace. To put it in other words, there's a clash between poetic, meaning creative, and anti-poetic regulatory vision of cyberspace. Just a few words about this. Well, while private stakeholders tend to underscore laissez-faire approach, the value of market-based equilibria, producing, designing, selling, maintaining control over the digital, states tend to, as public stakeholders of internet governance, tend to regulate, tend to determine which behaviors are legal, are unexpected, and which are forbidden when it comes to any forms of economic activities, such as taxing digital commerce, regulating public procurement, demanding compliance with national regulations. And the case of state control over private stakeholders in digital space has been evidenced for the last decade. One quick example, just very general for now, is EU General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. We all have it in the European Union. Is just a hassle, but well, this is implemented in 2018 as a regional regulatory mechanism, creating, and what is important, what is interesting, global standard, not regional, but global standard for safeguarding privacy, and it is set as European response to cybersecurity risks stemming from over-reliance on Chinese 5G infrastructure and GAFAM's big high-tech American corporations' control over online users' data. The rationale for GDPR suggests that it's extremely politicized and securitized. And this notion, I'm just quickly jumping to my conclusions, it has been relevant during economic fallout caused by the consequences of COVID-19 pandemic. Technological choices of the biggest high-tech companies, such as Apple or Microsoft, may frustrate the majority of European states, which are able to design their own solutions. One example is Stop COVID application in France. And it can fuel a quest for digital, for the quest for fragmentation in digital. Therefore, in post-coronavirus world, where the role of technology will be rising, I think that one of the main challenges for policymakers will be finding the right balance between control, which is not synonymous with surveillance, and human and privacy rights. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marek. As usual, time is running out fast, and that's a pity that for the last distinguished speaker, we have only less than 10 minutes. But nevertheless, that's my pleasure to present Jan Wouters as the next speaker, who is the director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. And he is a director of the Institute for International Law, while being a professor of international law in Leuven. So the floor is yours, Jan. As usual, you have a lot of things to discuss within a short period of time. That's another challenge. Go ahead. Try to do that.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me congratulate Marina and her team for this wonderful conference, and let me express the hope that we will see each other back at some stage in the real world in Moscow, because it's always such a great gathering and fun to see each other back. I will speak about, say, some reflections on Europe's digital strategy, but very briefly, as you rightly said. As we all know, new digital technologies are permeating a growing number of sectors of the economy and reshaping the way we live, we work, we interact on a daily basis. Many markets and businesses around the world are being disrupted and redesigned because of new technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, blockchain, biomedicine, data science, and so on. And on the other hand, the vulnerability of businesses and societies to sophisticated cyber attacks, counterfeiting, and other illegal actions is growing by the day. Policymakers in Europe find it difficult to keep track of these developments and make the right strategic choices. Business leaders in Europe are confronted with the breathtaking pace of innovation and technology development in China and in the United States. And as you know, and as also Professor Medora stated, with regard to the governance of data. He spoke about data zones. Well, those two countries, China and the US, present rather different models to that of the European Union. So too often businesses in Europe experience vastly different and uncertain sets of legal rules and regulations. And the competition with Chinese innovation and technology development is not neutral for them. The new technology developments in the US are also watched in Europe with a mix of admiration and hope, but also with worries for the development of Europe's own strategy. The fear of lagging behind in the promotion and development of European excellence and in the creation of added value for European growth is real. Now, next to these challenges in the field of digital technology, Europe is also on the cusp of a green technology revolution. As part of the EU Green Deal and the commitment to make Europe climate neutral by 2050, Europe's economy needs to be fundamentally transformed through green technology and energy, creating sustainable industry and transport. A European climate law is in the making, and the EU is seeking to form international green alliances to set global standards for sustainable growth. So in other words, both the digitalization and the greening of the economy are current priorities for the European Union, and both are profoundly affecting the Union's internal policies as well as its foreign relations. I think there is an authentic desire to catch up with both breathtaking developments, developing more adequate strategies and regulation that accommodate and do not stifle entrepreneurship, while also safeguarding European fundamental values, in particular the respect of human rights and the overarching goal of climate neutrality. To this, it should be added that in an ever more interdependent and interconnected world, regulatory policies of economically important jurisdictions, such as the US and the EU, do have extraterritorial policy impacts. And this occurs both by directly affecting the practices of businesses based in one jurisdiction seeking to do business in a second jurisdiction, but also indirectly through policy emulation, learning, and coordination. For the European Union, this has often been described as the Brussels effect. Furthermore, within international organizations, such as, for instance, the International Telecommunications Union, standardization efforts regarding cutting-edge challenges, such as artificial intelligence, facial recognition, and cybersecurity, are increasingly turning into battles between regulatory models of the main powers. It's, for instance, very interesting to see over the past 2 years how China, aided by a great number of Chinese companies, has tried within the ITU to come up with new standards with regard to, first of all, internet protocol, but also with regard to facial recognition. And it was especially on the latter initiative that, say, European countries really gathered against the initiative, referring to the need for reconciling this facial recognition with the protection of human rights. So that's the typical balancing act which the European Union is always trying to do, responding to new challenges and new technologies, while also staying true to its fundamental values and principles. I could talk a lot about recent initiatives. For instance, in March of this year, the European Commission presented the so-called 2030 Digital Compass, the European way for the digital decade, which is a vision and avenues for Europe's digital transformation by 2030. The proposals rest on 4 points: ensure more citizens and professionals have basic digital skills, provide sustainable digital infrastructure, promote the digital transformation of private businesses and public services, and encourage a system of cooperation between member states to monitor and promote these goals. There are lots of details and interesting ideas within the Commission proposals that I would love to discuss, but I'm seeing I just still have 20 seconds left. So let me just submit that although these initiatives are very valuable, I think they need to be a little bit more comprehensive. And to link again to the theme of this session in particular, I think it should be an overarching requirement for new EU initiatives in this area to go also and reconcile the initiatives with the objective of inclusive and sustainable growth. I spoke 3 seconds too long. I'm very sorry.
Thank you very much, Jon. Punctual as usual. We have a lot of questions to this session because on parallel we have a translation to the YouTube, and there are people watching us and listening to us. So although we have no more time officially, but I still inclined to ask at least one question because there's one guy called Luciano, and he's asking a question from the YouTube, and that will be a question to Jose Ciaba Serante, because that's a question related to the digitalization of international currencies. And the question is about introducing an international digital coin. What do you think about that, Jose? We need a very short answer to this very vast question. What do you think about it?
This was a matter of discussion in 1944 when the Bretton Woods system was thought of. And it was a discussion between William Dexter White, which was the representative of the US, and Lord Keynes.
Yeah.
And Keynes proposed an international currency. That was very hard at that time. Digitalization makes it, from the technological point of view, a feasible objective.
So is it different today from the point of view of—
Yes, and Mark Carney, a Canadian, but at the head at that time of the Bank of England in 2019, when the Facebook Libra project was launched, mentioned the possibility of going towards an international currency and stop using a national currency as a main global currency, which carries a lot of problems. So digitalization makes it, from the technological point, something that you can build upon. Not in the exact sense that Keynes thought. Keynes thought it as based on a basket of commodities. Now you might think that if the central banks issue their own national digital currencies, you might build a basket of digital national currencies as an international currency by itself. So that's feasible from the technological point of view. That it's very far from the political standpoint, which would be the full requirement. But in that sense, I would say we might discuss this issue in the future, but I'm not thinking that the world will be united enough to have only one international currency, but you might think of several or 2 or 3 international baskets, and that's not something out of reach. In the past, before digitalization, you might have the political willingness, but not the way to make it happen. And the farthest you achieve was especially the SDR from the IMF. So I think it's something you might be discussing in the future, and that would be a realistic aim. But I think we lack the political willingness to go that way. But that would be a very interesting development, in the sense that you will relax the heavy dependence of the global financial system and the global financial cycle on what happens in the US. And that would be a good thing.
Thank you very much, Jose. I hope Luciana will be able to sleep well tonight with that answer. Anyway, we will make a discussion further on, and I see that Professor Sanchul Park wants to make a comment on that point or on other point. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'd like to comment on the digital currency, the so-called digital coin. I think that, I agree with the Jose's opinion, and the precondition for the global currency, it must be that we have to build a global government. Without building global government, it is not possible in reality. If we look at the context of the European Union, we see it. For instance, the European Union is not a political union, but an economic union. Therefore, the European Union can build or create the common currency, but European Union does not have any common financial policy because there is no European government. So to have the common currency means to build a strong government as well as the feasible and transparent governance system. Without that, it's not simply possible. Technologically possible, yes, and ideologically possible, but not in reality. It is my personal opinion as an economist.
Professor Park, thank you for this contribution, but that could be another counter-argument to this argument because Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies do become internationally accepted currencies without being represented by a government. So there's something else that could be advanced as an argument whether the government is needed to suggest an internationally accepted currency or not. So well, that's a huge debate. We will not. Well, unfortunately, we don't have time to.
That's
continue.
a matter for another conference, I would say.
Yeah, that's for another conference. Exactly. Oh, let's organize a conference on international digital currency because that's a hot topic. Well, thanks everybody because a lot of questions raised, a lot of topics raised a lot of questions, and there are a lot of things to be discussed as regards the digital transformation for inclusive growth and development. So thanks very much all the contributors to this session, and we are looking forward to the new sessions within this conference. Thanks everybody for your contribution.
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marina, for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marina. Goodbye, Marina.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Hope to see you soon.
So as I understand, we now have a break, a short break.
Yes, we have a break, and we begin at 3 sharp.
Yeah.
Владимир Николаевич, вы не увидели, что у меня рука поднята была?
Didn't you see my hand was raised? Yeah, I'm so sorry. Maybe this session is not over yet. Okay, I'm sorry. It's okay. I'm sorry.
Санчул Парк перебил вашу руку.
Окей, спасибо.
Thank you.
Bye.
Recording stopped.
У нас... Лена, вы здесь, да? Андрей? Jan,
So, Marina,
welcome.
how are you?
It's great that you were able to change the schedule and join us from the start because...
No, that's better. I think it's better. In fact, I'm in the headquarters of Leiden University. I had to have so they gave me a room here quietly where I can sit on the edge. It's just that the light is a little bit sharp there. Let me see if there's a way to...
Recording in progress.
Yeah,
I think it's more or less okay.
Yeah, okay. No, I did when that bright light was shining at the top, it wasn't so nice. But it's nice to see Nice to see Danny. Nice to see
Jonathan.
Hello.
Hi. Hi.
Hello. Hi, Marina. Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone.
How are
Good
you?
to see you. Sorry, I don't see you in Moscow, but this will have to do for the moment, huh?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, unfortunately. We so much hoped that the situation will change, but
there we are.
Jonathan,
Hopefully
how are
next
things
year.
in Tokyo? How are things in Japan? Is it
A little bit late, not too bad actually. It's about 9:30 here, so actually no, it works out fine in terms of time. But yeah, Japan is getting better with the COVID situation. It's amazing how much it's improved over the last few weeks. But yeah, I'm sorry that in some other places, including Russia,
it's getting
unfortunate. Yeah, it's still difficult, but hopefully, we need to share the vaccines around the world, and then maybe we'll all be better off.
Victoria, hi. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Somehow the past 2 weeks, it's getting worse with more and more cases.
Yeah.
And then we have good vaccines, the number of people who are vaccinated. There are so many people who are reluctant to get vaccinated. I don't know whether this is Russian lack of trust. Because in the Soviet times, there were a count of vaccinations, and people were used to being vaccinated and from baby age. But then there were about 15 years of different approach towards medical care. And now there is sort of lack of trust, I think. Maybe this is the reason. Георгий Давидович, здрасте.
Hi, everybody. Добрый день. Well, listening to a conversation, I would say that I'm in New York now, and so it's, 70% of people are vaccinated, so, no one really cares about it any longer.
Yeah, in Netherlands, we only have masks on the public transport, and otherwise everything else is gone. We have the students are meeting in the class as normal.
But however, you have to show QR code or your passport, so your vaccination.
The Corona pass. We have to show the Corona pass to go to.
If you want to go to a restaurant, even to pizzeria.
That's right. Yeah,
it's crazy, but anyway.
Well, they did a study that was reported yesterday, and 1/3 of the restaurants don't look.
Well, they just pretend to look, Have you got vaccination? Yeah, of course. Okay, come on.
Yeah, exactly.
Shall we? Well, it's time, I think, to begin. Yeah. Shall we begin?
Yeah.
Victoria.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Marina. Really happy to welcome you all here. I'm sorry I couldn't come to Ranepa because, as you might know, there is a very big event ongoing in St. Petersburg at the moment. It's a Eurasian Women's Forum that is led by Valentina Matvienko. And we had extremely intensive days, 3 days, it's the third day now. We had a meeting with Vladimir Putin yesterday, and it's a really rich program. So I had some trouble finding the room where I could sit quietly for an hour and be able to join you, but I'm really happy I managed to do so because I believe what Marina is doing with her regular conference is really something unique, something that gives real added value to their international political thought in our countries. And with this particular conference and with Marina's efforts, I think we could, in fact, offer some new solutions that our world badly needs. And this particular session is exactly about brainstorming because we all agree that we want to live in a truly multilateral world. We do want to live in a world where we trust each other. We do want to live in a safe world. But in fact, none of these factors are present, and notwithstanding the rhetoric of different countries where they claim that they kind of adhere to multilateralism and adhere to trust building. We do not see this happening in reality. There is lots of geopolitical strife, lots of prone to conflicts. And that said, what we could do here is we could think of what are the ways out of the situation, right? So we have an extremely brilliant set of speakers in this session. And I would be summarizing at the end, but without further ado, allow me to call on the first speaker, Jan Scholte, who is the chair of the Global Transformations and Governance Challenges program at Leiden University, the Netherlands, and also professor of the School of Global Studies in University of Göteborg. Jan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Do you see the slide?
Yes, we do.
You said hopefully? Okay, great. Yeah, I thought for this session, maybe I would start just to put some evidence and data on the table about citizen and elite confidence in international organizations that colleagues and I have been collecting the last couple of years. I shared some of this at a previous session, but we've moved on with the analysis in the 2 years since I last spoke with you. So I thought maybe there's an update, and in any case, it sets the scene perhaps nicely for the rest of our discussion. Because if we're going to revive trust in multilateralism, it's kind of helpful to know what the current situation is in terms of how much trust people are having in multilateral institutions at the moment. So that's the question I wanted to put here. To what extent do people today regard global governance to have legitimacy? And again, legitimacy here as confidence, vital to the normative status of global governance, multilateralism, and its practical viability. And here looking at the belief or perception that people have regarding multilateral institutions, that they have the right to rule and that they exercise that right appropriately. So do people have confidence in, do they trust, do they believe in, do they have faith in these multilateral institutions? And so we did survey work through both the World Values Survey for citizens and through our own elite survey to try and find out how people are thinking about multilateral institutions today. So we asked in these surveys, how much confidence do you have in? And then we asked them the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. And then they answered none at all, not very much, quite a lot, a great deal, and we scored that. And then that gives us average numbers. And we talked to people in 5 different countries, actually 6 on the elite side, but the World Values Survey didn't happen in South Africa. So we only have elite data for South Africa. But 6 diverse countries, including Russia, Germany, United States, Philippines, South Africa, and Brazil. So what is the situation at the moment? If you look at the third here, all 6, if you take the average of all 6 international organizations across all 6 countries, or all 5 countries for citizens, then you can see that the overall average confidence in these main multilateral institutions, this data is from a year or 2 ago, is relatively miserable. And especially if you look towards the global economic institutions, WTO, World Bank and IMF, the average confidence amongst citizens, random sampled in these different countries, is really quite low. The World Health Organization, this is before the pandemic, scores relatively higher. If we look across the countries, then we see that amongst these countries that we looked at, Philippines, citizens get close to quite a lot of confidence in these multilateral institutions. Maybe they're happy that they perceive that the World Bank is serving their development needs. It's not always that easy to know. But that's on one side. And then if you look at the Russian citizens survey, you see that really the confidence in multilateral institutions is very, very low, extremely low, in fact. Even the United States, with its presumed privileged position in multilateral institutions, the citizen confidence in these multilateral institutions, again, this was taken in the later years of Trump, is also not very happy on the whole. So general levels of citizen confidence in multilateral institutions, medium and sometimes towards low. There was also some evidence about confidence in national government in those figures. And actually, we don't see that citizens have lower confidence in the international organizations than the national government. It's actually, they have pretty low confidence in both, in fact. That said, there's quite a bit of variation depending on which international organization you look at and which country you look at. In general, I think you could say that among citizens, amongst public opinion, there's not a crisis of legitimacy that would threaten global governance. But with numbers at 1.4 and 1.2, that's not a ringing endorsement of the kind that you could count on to expand global governance either. Just as a contrast, to look at the elite views, you can see that elites, and by elites we mean people in leading quarters of society and politics, so leading business people, leading academics, leading government officials, leading politicians, leading civil society organizers. We did a sample of the elites, and you can see that their average confidence in the multilateral institutions is higher than the average citizens. But on the whole, it's not up at a great deal. It's not as though the elites are sort of ringing the praises of multilateral institutions at the moment either. And when it comes to some of them, like the IMF, in fact, the numbers are really pretty low. But again, look at the third column from the right. The average confidence amongst elites in their respective national governments is also pretty low. So again, it's not as though multilateralism is being singled out for low confidence. By country, it varies also. And here again, you see Russia at the lower end. We did do the elite survey in South Africa as well. So Danny, you could explain to me why the elites in South Africa had such a low regard for the international organizations, and that includes the United Nations. Danny, I was really curious. I thought after 30 years of UN support for the anti-apartheid movement, you would expect to see elite views quite high for the UN, but that didn't turn out that way. Okay, so on the whole, the elite views, if the citizen views are kind of medium, the elite views are moderately high. They're moderately high confidence in the international organizations. Again, not that much difference between confidence in national and international institutions. Again, variation between organization and country. Amongst elites, you could say there's a fairly solid base of confidence. Again, it varies by country and organization. Overall, a fairly solid base of confidence, but again, not so glittering that you would imagine the elites are going to lead some great drive to expand multilateral institutions in the years to come. Then again, to put these two things together, you see the gap. So no matter which organization you're talking about, the elites have, if you put it all together, on average 30% higher confidence in the multilateral institutions than the citizens. So that's quite a bit. Yeah, it's 1.78 and the 1.43 in the middle. Again, there's a gap in confidence in national government as well. So it's not just about international organizations, but there's a gap. There's a gap. Except in the Philippines. For some reason, the citizens in the Philippines like multilateral institutions more than the elites. Again, open to your explanations why. But elsewhere, we see the gap, and you can see there in Russia too a very large gap indeed between the average citizens and the elites in Russia in terms of their confidence in multilateral institutions. So on the whole, we can say the elites have a higher view, have a more positive view of multilateralism than the general population. That means that elites can't count on a lot of citizen support for their initiatives. And indeed, they might be constrained in terms of their initiatives in multilateralism because they might know that there's not a lot of citizen behind it. The low citizen scores also helps to explain why populist politicians can find it profitable to use an anti-globalist discourse. There's plenty of ripe ground for their message. There's a problem from the perspective of democracy here. If the elites are not recognizing that they've got this gap and go chasing their visions of global governance, even though public opinion on the whole might be somewhere else. There's also a problem of democratic accountability because the elites are having one view and doing certain things, In national politics, they would have to face elections and the like, but in global politics, they don't have to face any formal democratic accountability towards citizens. So that raises a problem there too. Anyway, just a very quick run through some data, which maybe helps to set the scene for our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. You clearly showed that where there is a gap between, first of all, attitudes of elites and general public, but also probably if you could talk for a couple more minutes, just saying what can the epistemic community do in order to address the challenge, you know? And because we see that the gap between reality and vision is big. So what should be done to move closer to the ideal, how we can involve social partners in order, and whether it would help at all in order to promote a more ideal situation.
Yeah, I think it depends on whether you're talking about wanting to get greater support for the international organizations amongst elites, so the people who are more directly involved in the global governance processes, or are you more interested in getting more support from the general public? Because the drivers of these confidence are quite different for the two groups. If you want to improve raise the confidence that elites have in these organizations and processes, then it's very much improve the institutions, improve their procedures, improve their performances. So get them to be better at problem solving, get them to be more transparent. I mean, we looked at different institutional features that elites find most important in order to have more confidence. And the elites care about the institutions, how they work. The general public doesn't know how these institutions work, and so they don't really care about that. So they are driven much more by their perceptions of their own material well-being. They're driven much more by their sense of identity, whether they have a cosmopolitan identity or whether they are more nationalist in their inclinations. In other words, the general public's views of multilateral institutions aren't really driven so much by the details of what those institutions actually do. It's more driven by their general perceptions of their situation, the general political climate. They might love the WHO, for example, because they think the WHO is doing better for health. I mean, in that very generic sense. Or they may not like the IMF because they think the IMF is reducing their welfare in a very generic sense. But apart from that, we asked questions about to citizens about their knowledge of multilateral institutions, and it was pretty miserable. We gave them a little quiz, we said, where are the headquarters of the IMF? Which country is not a member of the UN Security Council? What does Amnesty International deal with as a subject? And, the numbers of citizens that got all three of those questions correct was like 20% or so. And you have to allow that some of that 20% was guessing.
Okay, I see. Thank you so much. Now let us move to Jonathan Lockhart, who is a professor of international relations of the Graduate School of International Peace Studies at Soka University in Tokyo. So what would be your view on those issues and what you think should be done in order that we move closer to the ideal, and that actually perception of both elites and citizens, they could be different, but nevertheless, both segments, they do need safe, inclusive, and world that would be sustainable for proper development. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victoria. It's a pleasure to see many of you again here that I've seen previously in Moscow and also last year virtually, of course. Yeah, thank you, Marina, of course, also for organizing the event and for inviting me here. So, yeah, I think global governance right now, obviously, I mean, the theme of this session and many discussions, of course, in other contexts about the challenges to multilateralism at a time when the perception is that we have these supposed geopolitical tensions, especially often people talk about the US versus China now, or tensions between the US and Russia sometimes, and other, and the British and the Europeans even now, the British and the EU, of course. So it's a difficult climate in many ways. But I was watching the other day the T20, the Think 20 summit, and Jeffrey Sachs was talking there again, as he has done in previous years, and he made an interesting point. He actually said that effectively we sometimes focus too much on geopolitics, and he kind of suggested he used the phrase that geopolitics was a kind of a silly game, something along those lines. And that actually in practice, when you get down to the details, I think if you look at global governance, beyond those, that posturing to some extent diplomatically, those kind of tensions that are often hitting the media headlines, I think when it comes down to global governance, it's quite fascinating how much actual cooperation you find between people from different countries, people obviously in the G20 context, you have the G20 Sherpas working together, ministers having regular meetings, the engagement groups, of course, where you get people from all across the world. So I do think that the complexity of the intricacies of global governance are sometimes hidden from the general public and don't get that kind of attention. But I think one thing that people such as ourselves can do perhaps would be to try to, as much as possible, to shine a light on what is done in global governance settings in dealing with issues like COVID-19, environmental issues, climate change, obviously, and the gender equality issues and how the G20 is engaged on that topic, and indeed the diversity of actors that have influenced those issues. So within the engagement group, certainly, and also different organizational contexts, including international organizations, where, for example, on gender equality, on the 25 by 25 labor participation goal, that the G20 adopted in 2014, that was one where you had these diverse actors from different settings, different countries, kind of working together to try and influence the G20 agenda. So I think we should remember that there is that complex interconnectivity going on. And again, that was something that Jeffrey Sachs mentioned as well, that we are kind of nodes within a multipolar, multilateral settings. We're not just two sides or something like that. So I think that what the epistemic community can do in that regard, I really think there is a lack of public awareness. I think if you increase, if you engage with the general public on issues that are happening within the G20 agenda, for example, get people aware of the agenda issues, get them to support certain goals, to engage with their parliamentarians, their governments, etc., and to find ways to be a kind of link for the engagement groups, the Think 20, the Civil 20, Business 20, etc., to actually engage both ways, not just with the governments and the delegates of the G20, but actually the general public, and it's, through media, through social media, through dialogue opportunities. A couple of years ago, I was doing some work with the Civil 20, and that was one point that I put in a discussion there. What are they doing to get their priorities across to the media? And of course, they are doing that. But I think that's a way, especially to think in terms of public outreach from us as an expert community towards the public, and not just focusing on governments, and again on all kinds of issues that have entered the G20 agenda: gender equality, sustainable development, now COVID-19, the governance of pandemics, and in that sense, networking and governance networks can reach, as I say, across various sectors of society, and not just focus on the elites, but also engaging with the public.
Okay, thank you so much. Definitely having wider networks is something that would, on the one hand, complicates the process of agreement because there is already different views within those networks between its members. But once you get even more complicated actors inside, this complicates further the process. But on the other hand, it is much more relevant. It's the same as we talk force against the international law, right? Rule of force, because international law is probably more difficult in terms of changes. It's more rigid. But on the other hand, it is much more long-term, and it clearly something that considers interests of all the parties without the strongest being dictating the will of itself. And of course, it also implies that all different layers of society are involved, and there is a general consensus within and beyond. So thank you so much. I know I was asked that Georgy Telereyev, who is the deputy chair of the board of the Russian National Committee on BRICS Research, had some other meetings, so might be have to leave earlier, and I would like to ask him to talk on those issues now. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure for me and a great honor to take part in this meeting. And I thank Marina and Ranipa for organizing it. And the issue is really very interesting and topical. Because the pandemics, among other things, showed that most of the international organizations, global governance structures, they spectacularly failed. The national egoism prevailed in all the countries, and so these organizations had neither ability, no desire to neither to devise some measures or to implement them. And for example, UN spend most of the time just writing papers and doing research rather than developing and agreeing on some joint measures. I think that's true for many other organizations as well. So it's useful to know that it's not just my just impression, but also supported by the data. Well, I appreciate Professor Jan Scholte doing this great research, and it supports the idea that the role of international organization is an international governance system as a whole is much more and more disregarded both by the elites and the general public. But unfortunately, we have no other. So this is something that we may try or not try to do it, but this is the only way. In the past, you know that we've been dealing with BRICS, and BRICS was seen as a sort of another actor, a big actor in geopolitical games, in the as one of the center powers, and that there was an idea that BRICS might be a full-fledged center for taking part in the global governments. Well, I couldn't say that this idea was fully implemented, and the BRICS and the pandemics showed that actually all the countries were also fighting at itself. And also, well, I would say that Jonathan's observation may be right, that people working in international organization and governance structure may be friendly and cooperative, but in fact, their job is dictating them purely one thing. That's the defense of national agenda. Whatever you can see in the press or in the open discussions, actually it masks the fact that unfortunately now the international organization governments are mostly governed, are mostly influenced by geopolitics. And we can do nothing with it because it's the same mode of behavior since tribal times of humanity. So we can try to improve the human's nature, but nevertheless, at least for now, all the actors in the international organization are purely have their national agenda on their mind first of all. Of course, some less essential issues like gender equality or sustainable issues, they might be more apt for finding compromise than others. But in the end, it all boils down to this general geopolitics confrontation, which is getting more acute day by day. For example, the Quad creation and the attempts to widen Quad, that's also a tremendous shift in the global politics that not so obvious at the first time, but it influenced the work of international governance system very soon. As for international law, of course, we are all for implementation of international law, but the problem is that the law is often interpreted differently. You know that in the U.S. this law system has been established and mastered for many centuries. And now, why the lawyers here receive the biggest salaries? Because the criminals know that if they have the right lawyer, this lawyer can bend the law in a way that the murderer will walk out free, or the thief would get just a small fine. This approach is also true for international law. If you have a goal, you always can somehow interpret the law, international law, in a way that suits your goal. Apart from that, the U.S. and other countries now speak about the so-called rules, which are not defined at all. And if we try to base the international governments on this established rules, how they call, I think that won't lead us anywhere. So what could be done? One idea is to employ more this concept of integration of integrations. That means that there should be some consultations and some kind of sharing position between big blocks of countries. Simple voting, for example, in the United Nations or other international organizations, just come to the situation when the small countries given their vote for the partners who are the strongest partners. They're just being, in many cases, sort of bribed or ordered. And these do not really represent the will of the world community as a whole. So maybe there should be some kind of a structure which would informally unite the competing blocks or competing geopolitical rival corporations to try to work out some consensus decision, not by a discussion open to public and aimed at propaganda purposes, but for finding a real solution which would be profitable for everyone. That's just an idea, but it just illustrates the fact that the current global governance system is less and less efficient, and I wouldn't be surprised if one day will just crumble down and the chaos will prevail. Sorry for this pessimistic view, but only having enough realism, we can deal with the issues which confront humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope we can, in any case, be able to come to a more, probably with the pessimistic view of the world that we're having now, we'll be able to come to a more optimistic solutions of how we could bring ourselves to a better, safer world. So if I could ask Marina to be the next one. Marina is the head of this conference. She's the head of the Center for International Institutions Research of the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, and also somebody who knows everything about the club mechanisms from in and from out, and indeed one of the most prominent experts in this field in Russia, but also beyond. Marina, if we could ask you to speak.
Thank you very much, Victoria. So we have discussed here that, and Jan clearly showed us that there is lack of, there is perception of low legitimacy of the international institutions, and Georgi said that there is the perception of effectiveness is also very low. The network governance does not help much, so it involves civil society and epistemic community and business. So what about accountability? Accountability has been part of the G20. I will limit this to G20 governance without making it too broad. Accountability has been part of the G20 since its inception. For the Pittsburgh summit, the Financial Stability Board reported to the G20 leaders on progress in implementing the London summit recommendations, and OECD WTO UNCTAD reported publicly on adherence to the commitment on resisting protectionism. The IMF submitted its first note on stocktaking of G20 responses for the London summit and the first mutual assessment process report for Toronto. So by the end of the G20 formative period, it established a wide range of accountability mechanisms, including joint reports by International Energy Agency, OPEC, OECD, World Bank on fossil fuel and other energy subsidies. And progress report and immediate actions of the Washington Action Plan prepared by the UK chair for London became a first step in the self-accountability practice. Korean presidency introduced the practice of outlining policy commitments by G20 members. In 2012, the G20 formalized self-accountability process by establishing the Loss Covers Accountability Assessment Framework to ensure country-owned, concrete, consistent across members, fair, open, transparent, and based on the comply and explain approach assessments. Thus, the accountability and self-accountability process became inherent in the G20 governance, covering key decisions and involving major international institutions. The G20 social partners, and especially the B20 and Think 20 members, self-initiated their assessments of the G20 performance on the business recommendations and compliance with the G20 priority commitments, respectively. Thus, there is an impressive flow of comprehensive and area-specific accountability reports with clear pre-summit tides creating peer and public pressure. But does the established accountability system contribute towards enhancing legitimacy, effectiveness, inclusiveness of the G20? Well, it is hard to give a calculated estimation, as we do not know what G20 performance would have been in absence of these mechanisms. But with regard to the effectiveness, my guess is that to some extent it does, providing evidence base and data, ensuring continuity and reputational pressure, proposing policy recommendations and targets for further progress. With regard to the legitimacy, the international institutions report legitimized the G20 actions, given that through the structured accountability relationship with the international institutions, the G20 answers for its decisions and performance to the international community it affects. But this accountability is indirect and insufficient. With regard to inclusiveness, the international institutions' involvement in monitoring, assessment, consultation, and contribution to decision-making enhances the G20 transparency, but the technocratic nature of the accountability reports make them scrutable to the public and does not help in enhancing inclusiveness. So there is still a gap between the ideal and the reality. The reports and accountability address the transparency and consultation aspects. To a certain extent, they provide evaluation for possible corrections, but the correction dimension remains opaque. What the epistemic community could do. The epistemic community seeks to contribute to improving the G20 effectiveness, legitimacy, inclusiveness, and accountability through Think 20 recommendations, engagement and monitoring compliance. However, so far, the link between the stock-taking findings and recommendations is missing, and there is limited understanding of the impact of engagement on the G20 deliberations, decisions, and performance. We could try to better ground our recommendations on evidence from the stock-taking, track the recommendations' life and transformation, if any, in the G20 discourse and decisions, and improve the quality of our engagement, assessing what worked and what did not. This year, the Think 20 Task Force on Reforming the Think 20 initiated the work to enhance the quality of engagement. But of course, the success will depend on the will of the G20 to engage and listen as well. But it may contribute, if successful, it may contribute to enhancing the G20 governance accountability and inclusiveness. Thank you very much. I will stop at that.
Thank you so much, Marina. I think if Marina doesn't mind, I understand that Mr. Jonathan Fried has another meeting also, and we will ask him to speak now if possible, if this is not and Mr. Fried is the Prime Minister of Canada's personal representative to the G20 and coordinator for international economic relations and global affairs Canada. In 1720, he is senior non-resident associate of the economics program, Center for the Strategic and International Studies, and he's been for a long time a practitioner, and this would give another flavor to what Jonathan has to tell us. If we could have you now.
Well, thanks very much, and sorry to jump in a bit out of order, but let me first of all offer my own thanks to and admiration to Marina, both for the conference and for all the work of RENEPA, and Victoria, you yourself, modest as you are, and the Institute and studies and research that you lead as well. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be working under you today. So yes, you've labeled me a practitioner, but as a longtime practitioner, let me go back several decades, because if you start with the United Nations, while the Charter sets out some principles for international cooperation and joint efforts, ultimately coming out of the World War, it was an affirmation of sovereignty, territory, non-interference, and thus the international law framework was still premised on a Westphalian system that each country is the master of its own population and own borders. So although in the post-war world we've sought a balance between a supranational efforts and national sovereignty, the balance for many decades had been in favor of the primacy of the nation state. There's some literature out there that would say maybe beginning in the 70s, we began to shift as an international community from preservation and respect for territorial integrity and citizenry within states to an international law and policy community for common welfare and for global public goods. But that tension remains. And as we see today in trade, in finance, in the response to COVID, any government of any political or social system's first obligation is to its own citizens. So if you're a democracy trying to earn votes, if you're a more authoritarian, shall we say, Chinese regime that's concerned about social cohesion and the unity of the state, it's the same thing. You look after your own people first, and as we see in times of tension, sometimes at the expense of other countries. So the process of building a consensus for cooperative efforts, be it on climate, on trade, or on finance, it has to be a bottoms-up approach. So second point regarding the post-war world is for the majority of this period, we've relied on government representatives almost exclusively as the voice of their citizenry for rulemaking and for development of frameworks. And even during the Cold War period, if you think about it, it's not new to see tensions among different regions and different levels of development. One of my first roles serving at the United Nations was to participate in drafting of General Assembly resolutions. So you had the Western European and others group caucusing to develop their position. The G77 and non-aligned would meet. The then Soviet Union would convene the Eastern European and friends on their side. Each would come with a position. There would be small groups to hammer out compromises, and you would build out almost iteratively smaller to bigger consensus. That's true in the WTO, where I've also served. Although there the communities are not so much politically based as interest or sectoral based. There will be agricultural exporters versus net food importers, and so on. So all of which is to say that the process of going back to the initial presentation, the process of assessing the effectiveness of international institutions can't be separated from the shareholders, which are those who are authorized to direct and decide, namely the governments themselves. But that brings me to a final, more provocative point, which is I would argue that in this century, rulemaking has become remarkably heterogeneous. It's too important and too specialized to be left to governments themselves. If you take what's unfolding on matters digital, for example, private industry, citizenry, various parts of industry, whether it's the people who do the undersea cables versus the content providers, versus the social media platforms, all have something to say as to what the standards are and will be. And this is playing out on 5G and so on peace and security equally. If you think about how we developed a landmines convention, it was more than governments that helped make that happen. Look at environment and what's unfolding in the COP process. Again, quite mixed and very important to have the full range of stakeholders, not just as observers, but as participants in the framework and rulemaking process. So although Jonathan rightly identified the engagement groups in the G20 as an element, it's broader than that. And depending on the subject matter, you know, underneath the G20 summits and behind the Sherpas lie quite an industrialized process of several ministries following specialized tracks. There's an annual meeting of health ministers, of trade ministers, of development ministers, and so on. Each of them have communities of interest, and they're not adequately voiced solely by way of the formalized engagement groups. And thus the officials under the Sherpa in those specialized fields, not only, as one of you referred to earlier, form their own community of interest, because in specialized fields, there's a college of mutual respect for specialization. Put a group of veterinarians in the same room from different countries, they'll all bring a very similar science base to their orientation in developing the rules for agricultural trade. But that community of specialized interests each have their own tentacles to quite a range of stakeholders. So I'll finish up by coming back to Jan Art's survey, because I'd love to read more deeply. I wonder whether the citizenry is expressing skepticism about legitimacy because of the lack of results, they're failing to deliver, or because of lack of representativeness, that they don't reflect the citizens' interests. That's two very different things. Each of our institutions have different modes of connecting. There's been talk of a parliamentary role at the United Nations, for example. The International Chamber of Commerce seeks a seat at the table. We haven't really advanced beyond the engagement group model to think about how to integrate stakeholder communities, except in very specialized fields, and maybe that's appropriate. So I'll stop there just to be provocative. I have 10 more minutes here, so I really am sorry. So there you go.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That's good that you will stay. We have now Daniel Bradlow, who is a Sarante Professor of International Development Law and African Economic Relations of the Center for Human Rights, Faculty of Law of University of Pretoria, and would be great if he takes up your provocation, and maybe then we can see where we arrive today. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks to Marina for bringing us all together. Even though it's virtual, it seems like we're almost in Moscow, having a very interesting conversation. The benefit of being the last speaker is I've heard what everybody has to say. Some of what I was going to say has been said, but it allows me to maybe be a little bit more provocative than I might have been if I'd gone earlier in the process. But I found Jan Out's surveys very interesting, but not all that surprising. The only thing that surprised me is that the WHO is the most popular of the international organizations. The fact that the IMF is the least popular, I think, makes a lot of sense and is not all that shocking. And I want to build on what Jonathan said and suggest that one of the reasons that the IMF is so unpopular, and I think you could expand this to almost all the other international organizations, is that they're no longer fit for purpose. That in fact, citizens might be ignorant about what these organizations do, and they might not fully understand exactly how they fit into the governance of their societies and impact their societies, but they understand that they're not delivering and that they're actually operating in ways which are inimical to their interests. So let me talk, and I would suggest that there are three reasons for that, or three ways we can look at that. And I'm going to use the IMF as an example for all of those. And the first one is that the IMF has lost power. It's no longer as influential as it used to be, but it still throws its weight around a lot. And let me give you an example just to show that. If you compare the role of the IMF during the 1982 Latin American debt crisis with its role during the current COVID crisis, and they're very different crises, obviously, in many, many ways. But the one thing they have in common is that they both threaten to be existential and systemic crises, I should say. But let me just give you a little bit of a picture of the difference in the IMF's role at the time. So in 1982, Mexico had a total debt of $80 billion. It owed in that year $10.8 billion in debt service payments, which it was unable to pay. Both them and its creditor banks went to the IMF asking for help. The IMF gave Mexico $3.4 billion of the 10 that was owed. The US government threw in an extra $2 billion, and the IMF was able to push the banks not only to contribute money, new money, but also to renegotiate some of the debt. Because it was putting in almost a third of what Mexico owed and was the biggest contributor, it had the most bargaining power in that situation. If you look at the COVID crisis, when in March last year, when the economic and financial impacts of COVID hit, central banks were the key actors that moved and quickly threw $10 trillion into the international system through swap arrangements and through other creative arrangements, and then through them financial markets distributed monies to emerging markets and to all sorts of other debtors. The IMF, up to today, has contributed about $120 billion to 87 countries. It's contributed another 700 million, not billion, to in debt relief to the poorest countries. The World Bank has added another 160 billion to that. And the IMF, through the SDRs, most of which are not going to developing countries, have added another 650 billion. So against the central bank's $10 trillion, the IFIs have barely managed to come up with a $1 trillion, and over a much longer period, and with many more conditions attached to it. So its credibility and its ability to actually act as a key governance actor has been diminished dramatically. The key actors now are central banks and private financial institutions, rather than the official creditors. Second thing I'd say is what's changed also is the IMF is no longer just a macroeconomic financial and monetary institution. It's now being forced, and it cannot avoid this, having to deal with environmental issues, with questions of inequality and other social issues. And these issues are inevitably political, complicated, and involve huge amounts of discretion, which is part of the reason why the recent scandal in the World Bank over the doing business report and its impact on the IMF is so significant. I would suggest nobody knows how you include environmental and social issues in a really effective way in governance and in policy making. But the fact that the IMF is having to do that with structures that are not designed really to accommodate those sorts of issues is creating serious problems and undermining its legitimacy even more. And the third thing that follows from that is, and this goes back to something that Jonathan said, is the international order was set up after the Second World War based on respect for state sovereignty. And it still operates on the basis of respect for state sovereignty. But the issues that the world's having to deal with now, like environment, like climate, all these issues are issues which really undermine sovereignty because they can't be dealt with without being dealt with collectively. They're issues that are intensely political, that involve deeply the social mores and customs of each individual society. But international organizations and other actors are having to come in and to engage with those issues. And we don't have the structures for how you incorporate those, how you allow a role for international organizations and for non-governmental actors. And we have international organizations whose governance structures, their immunity, their weighted voting in the case of the UN and of the IFIs, it's totally unsuitable for this sort of politically sensitive world in which we live. So I would say for all those reasons, it's not surprising that legitimacy of institutions is declining or has declined, and that it's a real problem. I would say for an epistemic community and how we can fit into that, I mean, in an ideal world, the answer to this is that there should be a process leading up to a new Bretton Woods and a new Dumbarton Oaks conference. I think we all know that in the short to medium term, that is politically totally unrealistic, barring some kind of terrible catastrophe, which none of us want, which means that really the challenge is how do we come up with a process of reform and transformation that can lead us towards where we really have to go over time. And we can come up with small steps that can be taken, but the role of the epistemic community is to help come up with those ideas of how within the existing structures we can create the reforms that open up the spaces that allow these issues to be addressed with in an effective way and keep moving that process forward. That's a challenge. There are ways we can do some of that, but I think that's the challenge for the epistemic community. And I'll leave it there for the moment. I'm happy to give some examples maybe in discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we'll have to be wrapping up because we had only 1 hour that was allocated for our session. But with that, I will ask probably Marina as a host to give a few words in terms of, because we had a whole range of discussions, first of all, on legitimacy of international institutions, of how the different layers of the group, be it elites or general public, view those, how much those give credibility, how much their actions offer credibility to their existence, what could be, who are the stakeholders, with nation states being the ultimate influence behind what's actually happening in this multilateral system. The question is, and I think I mentioned it at the very beginning, but I would like to reinforce it. So we have a number of engagement groups in such institutions like the G20, BRICS, G7, etc. Just enough to mention T20, Civil 20, Civil BRICS, BRICS Business Council, Women 20, Women in Power, their Women Business Alliance, etc., etc. There are a number of outreach formats, and how much those social partners would be able to provide for this two-way street between governments and general public, and through that enhance their legitimacy of the international organizations. Marina.
Thank you for the question, Victoria. In fact, yes, switched on. In fact, I think that this is very important power, our engagement groups, which is unfortunately not, and I thought that maybe Jonathan would mention that, because he wrote an interesting essay, an article about the role of networked governance and how it sustains actually the G20 process. But I think it works the same way in the BRICS. And this is something, this process of networking, including the Think 20 and academic BRICS and Civil 20 and Civil BRICS, this is exactly what can address the issue of lack of awareness on one hand. On the other hand, if successful, it can address the issues of enhancing accountability, transparency, and to a certain extent legitimacy. But that would demand the G20 itself, or the BRICS, the institutions themselves and the leaders to engage and to listen. So this demands reciprocity, which I think is at this point missing. And okay, we are preparing our recommendations. We are trying to do evidence-based policy proposals and assessments of what has been done. We are trying to be optimistic and pragmatic about our engagement. But more and more, it seems to me that though the game, the G20 and BRICS and other institutions are engaged in this game, they are not really listening to the community. And this is one reason, and a serious reason for failing legitimacy. So, and I'm an optimist by nature, but in this part, remembering how in 2013 we tried to engage with Think 20 with G20 through Think 20 and Civil 20, and how the international community, epistemic community and civil community was enthusiastic about it. I see that this enthusiasm is failing. And frankly, I don't know what to do about it, because the challenges we are facing are immense. And Jose mentioned today, and Rohinton also mentioned today in the previous session, the issues which are related to digital governance. And we know what is happening with the platforms now, and we know that the government, we face the governments fail to come up with coordinated actions to create regulation or governance of these digital platforms. We spoke about this at the last conference, and we keep talking about this, but actually nothing happens. And we talked about digital stability board. We today also mentioned global digital governance compact, but nothing happens, and the divisions between the US, EU, China and Russia are acute, and they remain acute. I know that there is nothing else we can do but continue this engagement between ourselves, and this is very important, and continue to promote our ideas about the need for coordinated response, including to these digital governance challenges. And in that regard, I would like to thank everyone who has contributed to the debate in the conference, and I look forward to its continuing in the other fora. And I remain an optimist and think that some of our ideas and some of our efforts may dribble over into the minds of the thinkers and the decision makers in the G20, the BRICS, and other institutions we try to engage with. And thank you very much, Victoria, for moderating this. I know that it has been difficult for you to find time for this, but it was great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Marina. It was my real pleasure to be here. And in fact, I can promise you that our deliberations, the main ideas would be further put to, well, obviously MFA would be your, or presidential administration, your power, but I could forward it while I'm here to the Parliament of the Russian Federation. And they are very much active in terms of their international links with their friends from the G20. And so Her Excellency Matvienko and her deputy, Ms. Galina Karelova, they're very much putting their effort into having their own, supporting the ideas that come from other segments from epistemic community in order to make the world safer and better and more inclusive. So they would definitely pass forward those ideas to their vis-a-vis in other parliaments.
Yeah, well, that's another step towards legitimacy. The engagement with the parliamentarians. They are more representative, after all.
Yeah, that's true. And there is a big
bureaucrats
now of parliamentarian diplomacy. It's been very new and it's been evolving further. So I think we should use all the opportunities, both expert and political. And thank you so much, Marina. Thank you, everybody, for being such wonderful speakers. And I really hope that RANEPA with Marina and would be further organizing such wonderful events. And
Eric, you're so quiet. Yeah, sorry, I.
Yes? Georgi David, you wanted to say something?
It's called something, isn't it?
No, I just wanted to say bye-bye because I'm already in the other meeting. You know.
Okay.
We just had Saturday yet. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Goodbye to everyone. Goodbye, and thanks to
you.
everyone. Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.